We're going to do a short discussion of international trade agreements, and the reason it will be short is because right now there's no realistic prospect of any major new international trade agreements, and there is a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in future. So we'll just do this one very briefly. When countries wish to reduce trade barriers between themselves, they can create a trade agreement, and a trade agreement aims to reduce or even eliminate trade restrictions. Now, one principle that the World Trade Organization requires is that lower tariffs offered to one country should be extended equally to all WTO members. I have to say, though, that there are many loopholes that a country could use to try to avoid sticking to this principle. And the WTO is a multilateral trade agreement, not a one country to one other specific country agreement. I'll just talk about the intuition for multilateral trade agreements. The essence of the problem with tariffs can be, given the right conditions, the logic of the famous prisoner's dilemma game, which I will assume everybody's familiar with. And the idea is that, in theory at least, if country A imposes a tariff on imports from country B, and if country B does not retaliate with tariffs of its own, it is possible, in theory, that country A may become better off. Now, there are a lot of conditions to become better off from a tariff, and becoming better off at the national level includes counting the revenue that the government gets. So individual importers can still be worse off in the tariff country, but given the net revenue and various other conditions being right, it is possible that if you add up the surplus, the gain for the entire country, it will become a positive number, and the foreign country will be worse off. So the logic of the prisoner's dilemma is that if both players, both countries, are rational, they will both choose to impose tariffs. And the problem is that if both countries impose tariffs on each other, that both countries are poorer than if they had stayed with free trade. But a single country on its own will not choose to forego tariffs, because if the partner country imposes a tariff and your country does not, then your country can be worse off. So we have, in the prisoner's dilemma, a paradoxical solution where countries sort of have no choice except to impose a tariff, because if they don't, the other countries will anyway. And so by imposing a tariff, you are less worse off than if you stuck to free trade. So to be clear, if everyone's imposing a tariff on everyone else, individual countries are trapped in a sort of suboptimal equilibrium only to the extent that they are able to minimize their loss. So, in the prisoner's dilemma, the solution is, if you can create a binding agreement, a system that binds the two players to agree to, well, in this case, have no tariff, both countries can become better off. Again, you need a sort of supervising authority to ensure that both countries stick to the agreement to impose no tariff. So this is why everyone, in a sense, can be better off under multilateral trade agreements. It's not a zero-sum game. It's rather preventing a race to the bottom type of policy. So trade agreements can be of different kinds, and one kind is a regional trade agreement where neighboring countries give preferential treatment to each other. So to some degree they form a sort of bloc in distinction to the rest of the world. And because of the gravity equation, we know that countries who have freer trade with their neighbors are going to benefit more, or even more, than a free trade agreement with partners who are far away. So that's one kind of trade agreement. It's restricted to a particular region or neighboring countries. A free trade agreement or free trade area is an agreement where countries have free trade with each other, but with the added ingredient of barriers against the rest of the world. So a free trade area is free within, if you're within the area, within the group, but the free trade area can still have serious barriers against trade from countries outside the group. So I thought I'd get some data just to show you evidence that when neighboring countries create freer trade with each other, they become better off. And this is data from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. They have a big database of all kinds of data called Fred Data that is free and easy to download and easy to manipulate. And Fred lets you put the data into template graphing images, so you don't have to do that yourself. You don't have to take the data and then slog through plotting it yourself. So that's very handy. So the free trade agreement, now to be clear, free trade agreements are not totally free trade. There are lots of exceptions and limits. The free trade agreement between the United States and Mexico was enacted just after 1990. And you can see from this diagram that the initiation of the trade agreement between the United States and Mexico, also called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, which also includes Canada, I should say, the US, Canada, and Mexico, resulted in freer trade. And what you see then is an increase in trade between the United States and Mexico. And that increase continued fairly consistently, except for recessions. And there was a recession around 1999. And you see a dip because of that. There was, of course, the Great Recession of around 2007 to 2009. And you see a huge dip there. And then you see another dip after 2015, and then of course the 2020 severe fall. Now the point of the diagram is to show that even though Mexico was a smaller country than the United States, its exports increased at a very significant rate right after the agreement, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So it seems like the agreement worked the way it was intended to. And here's a list of current free trade agreements that the US has with foreign countries. And again, it doesn't mean completely free trade, it really means freer trade. And it's not a long list. And you can see the pattern of free trade agreements includes countries that are either already developed or physically close to the USA, physically close relatively speaking in terms of being in Central or South America. So that's not a very long list considering how many potential partners there are in the world. So we are really at a low point in terms of free trade agreements in the world, and it remains to be seen how this will work out. Whether there will be, after the pandemic is over, whether there will be a resumption of new free trade agreements or not. And while we're at it, I'll just, as the final slide, include a link to the American Economic Association Resources for Economists page, which links to a comprehensive and easy to use set of data to do with all aspects of economics around the world, including time series data and cross-sectional data and international data and much more. So if you should be in need of some economics data to do some kind of sample analysis or investigate some kind of subject, this is one place you can go and you can be sure that the data is not only comprehensive, it's been checked for accuracy, but it's also in a form that's easy for you to download and easy for you to use. And that's the end of this short video.